Now, Diana is back, so we're going to get ready for our next session, which is all about gamification of research, gamified research. Diana, hello.
Hello. Am I unmuted now? Yes, I am.
You are. Hello. So thank you so much for coming and joining us today. You know, I'm a massive fan of your research. So with that, do you want to share your screen, your slides?
I will share my screen.
And over to you. Hello.
Get it all going. And
Diana and I have been working together for about 8 years, I think now. Diana has a background in maths education and using games. And I'm going to let her tell you about her maths game in detail, but it's absolutely fantastic. And I expect lots of questions generated from her talk. Diana, over to you.
Thank you. And first of all, I want to thank Cauldron very much for this invitation and also for being such a great partner to work with to create our games on the Gorilla platform. It's been really 8 years, Joe. I can't believe it. Okay, so this is about designing and testing the constructionist approach to games for basic maths, as Joe mentioned. So why do we need games for basic maths? Well, special needs learners with dyscalculia, that's 6% of all learners of all ages, can learn to count, but they solve all problems by counting. And to give you a sense of what this is like, what they will do is to say which is the larger of two playing cards showing 5 and 8. They'll count all the symbols on each card. And then to count down from 10 in ones, they'll count 1 to 10, and then 1 to 9, and then 1 to 8, and so on. They can't count backwards one by one, as most of us find quite easy. So they have no sense of the internal structure of numbers, is what this means. A number sequence is, for them, it's a little like the alphabet. It's just a random sequence. And so, of course, that makes arithmetic very difficult. So our question now is, can we design a game that would help dyscalculics and early learners to understand the internal structure of numbers? Why constructionism? Well, constructionism was defined originally by Seymour Papert at MIT, and it's since been interpreted as the learning situated in a meaningful context. It must have a meaningful goal in view, meaningful to the learner, and achieved through learners' constructions of something. The feedback must show the result of their action in relation to the intended goal. The learner then uses that direct feedback from the environment to improve their own constructions. And so the learner is able to work out how to improve their action without help, either from a teacher or from the computer advice. Now, game mechanics and learning goals. We know from research on game-based learning that the game mechanics must be aligned with the learning goals to be effective. What does that mean exactly? How, for example, do we create the game mechanics that will help learners get a sense of the internal structure of numbers? And what that means is that for each stage of the game, what we're trying to ask as designers is, what kind of cognitive processing do we want to try to elicit here? Can you take that away? Sure. So one recent model of game-based learning is due to Plas, Homer, and Kinzer, who propose the relations that we can probably all agree on, that almost any kind of game provides a sequential structure of challenge, response, and feedback, repeating for different challenges. But of course, it's the learning theory behind any educational game that really informs the design of each of these things. I'm going to focus on what makes a constructionist game different, namely the kind of cognitive processing it elicits. So to help learners understand the internal structure of numbers, a constructionist approach would define the challenge for this goal as being able to use given sets to construct a target set. And the response action would then be to be able to join or split given sets. And then the immediate feedback is the result of that action. Either sets turn into other sets that include the target, or the sets turn into other sets which don't include the target, and that's all. That has to be sufficient for the learner to work out what to do next if they don't make a target. So the game designer has to ask, what kind of cognitive processing is being elicited here, first of all, when the learner is presented with the challenge, and then when they receive the feedback and have to do something with it. So let's look at how those features work in the context of a specific constructionist game. And this one is called number beads. Well, the learning goal here is to give learners, either early learners or dyscalculics of any age, that all-important sense of the internal structure of numbers. They have a play area here with sets of beads with different numerosities. And the goal is to try and make that target set at the top, the twos. And they can do this by joining or splitting. Here they've split off some numbers and then put them together to make twos. Then they start getting clever and they realize they can do two sets at a time, and so they can complete the run faster and get their rosette. Then in the next stages, we can move on to looking at, for example, in this second format, it's slightly different. In this case, each of the sets has a digit associated with it, so they can begin to make that association between the numerosity of the number of beads and the digit. And you can make your sixes here now in a variety of different ways. They're adding a 5 and a 1 and a 4 and a 2, and they've happened to have made some 3s, so they can do that as well. And gradually, the rewards of these stars are building up here so that they can begin to see how it's going. And then as the mechanics, as the game progresses, we begin to fade some of those. We take away the colors, we take away the beads, and they're just in the final stages, they're just left with the digits themselves, as in this particular case. So it's a way of giving you a sense of what the game mechanic is here, is what I'm trying to do, is that the learners are able to find out, they're able to explore how to make numbers out of other numbers, and then begin to have a sense of their internal structures. So from the nature of the game mechanics of challenge, response, and feedback, what we're trying to elicit is thinking about that relationship between given sets of beads and how you can construct the target by joining and splitting them. And then when they see what happens as a result, they're comparing sets they've constructed with the target set. If they're different, the challenge is to decide on how to make one that is like the target. If they're the same, they've made a target, and they get a new challenge. So they have to reflect on how their actions made that set and how they might have to change their actions to make the target. So that's a lot of thinking going on. And suppose instead the learning theory was using a multiple choice question mechanic. Well, in this case, the learner just has to decide which of 3 possible sets must be added to a given number to make the target. So the only cognitive processing needed is to decide between options A, B, and C. That is, should I add a 3 or a 5 or a 6, for example? And if it's wrong, then they have to decide between the 2 choices now left, and that's all. Now, of course, they may think hard about it, but that kind of complex analytical thinking is not elicited by the game mechanics. And that's really what we're trying to do in any kind of game design. Well, what about the cognitive goal of how do fractions work? Well, again, using the constructionist approach, we try to align the game mechanics with the learning goal. And that means, again, asking what kind of thinking we want to elicit from each of the learner's actions. Well, here we're working with different objects. These are unit rods, and the game mechanic now is combining and splitting fractions of that unit to construct a given staircase. So we've got to make these rods. I'm just going to move this on a little bit here. And you can see that the game mechanic here then is to try and split these rods. And this is a wonderful device invented. We have to thank Nick Hodges of Cauldron here for inventing this splitter, because it's such a powerful embodied way of creating fractions out of fractions. So they're splitting this quarter into 3. They're making 12ths. Well, 12ths was too small, so they're putting it back together again, having another go. Got 12ths again. No, put it back together. Be very careful and get 8ths, and you've got your smaller fraction. And what's so nice about that splitter is that it's showing you that the more fractions you've got, the smaller they are, even though the number in the fraction is bigger. I'm not going to try and move this on a bit, if I can, there it is, to somewhere like this, which is in a later part of the game where they have to match now the fractions to these symbolic representations of fractions. Here they've tried to make an eighth. Notice, let me pause this. So they're trying to make an eighth, and they're not sure if these are eighths. So they can check by using this, another clever device from Nick, which is a sort of ruler, and you can count how many of these we've got in the unit rod. And there are 8 of them, so therefore it must be an eighth, and indeed it is. Okay, so you can get a sense again that this is exactly the same kind of approach of designing the actions that elicit thinking about what a fraction is and how to make it out of other numbers, other fractions in this case. So to summarize all that, a constructionist game provides the type of challenge, response, and feedback which is needed to elicit the cognitive processing to help the learner achieve the objective. And from the game designer's point of view, that means you start with the learning goal, decide what kind of thinking it takes to achieve it, and what kinds of game mechanics elicit that thinking. Here are the links to the 2 games. If you'd like to try them out, please take a look. And finally, I just want to say a sincere thank you to Cauldron for all that wonderful help with turning our rubbish ideas into something that really works smoothly. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome. Not at all your rubbish ideas. You're absolutely wonderful ideas. I'm always blown away by the idea of designing games to elicit in the brain of the person playing them the thinking and thought process that are going to change how they think about the thing you want them to think about. Like it's so neat and so clever. So if you were impressed by that, just type in the chat there, like impressed or something like that, so Diana knows you were blown away by this idea of designing your task to change how somebody thinks about something in the first place. Now, I have.
Yeah, but the point is, Jo, that you got it. You and Nick got the idea, and it just isn't that easy necessarily for you to get it, and that's what we appreciate.
Well, I just want to say that the chat is blowing up with feedback from people who've been watching, saying they're very impressed. Wow, totally
very
impressed.
Cool. Oh, great.
So they're all very impressed as well. Now, I have a question for you. So I get it, like with maths games, I really see it because maths aren't, you're sort of playing with objects in your head. Could you use the same approach to designing language games or something different? Like what could that look like?
Yes, you could, because I think the basic idea of constructionism is that it captures how we learn from the world around us. And when Pavitt introduced this idea, he talked about microworlds. And essentially what we're doing is we're creating these little worlds that behave. And as long as you can have a kind of model of that world and what you're trying to learn within it, then yes. And there's aspects of language learning which are quite rule governed. And I could imagine that you could put into that a game where you're constructing parts of language to make other parts of language, for example. I mean, that sort of constructionist approach is more or less what we do. But then similarly, you could have it in all sorts of other areas, like having it if you've got a good model of inflation or of cash flow in a business or climate change and things like that. You've got to have an artificial micro world that you then manipulate. But that would be very straightforward. I don't think it would be so easy with things like philosophical discussion and interpreting poetry exactly, but those kinds of ideas about how you understand the system, that's what you can use it for.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. What we're going to do now is go to Nico. Nico, do you want to start sharing your slides? We're going to go to Nico, who's going to present how he's used games to investigate cognitive control. But Diana is going to be sticking around to answer questions in the Q&A, but also for a panel discussion at the end. So with that, Nico, over to you.
Hi, hello. Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can, yes. Do you want to turn your camera on?
I'm trying to, but apparently the host has disabled it, so I'm not sure I can. Never mind. You're just going to have to imagine me on my sofa at home. Okay, here you go. Thank you so much, Jo, for the wonderful invitation to come here. There you go. I can start my video. To present here today. It's a really wonderful opportunity, and it's actually pretty much one of the first times that we're going to be presenting data from the games that we have designed together with Cauldron. So the topic of the talk is training cognitive control using a gamified approach, and I'll take you through step by step what exactly it is that we mean by that. In terms of the background then, what exactly it is that we mean by cognitive control. So this is very much to do with something that we try and achieve each day, that is reach and manage goals on a short-term and a long-term basis. So we go throughout our day trying to achieve those goals, be it making breakfast or getting some work done in the short term, or slightly more long-term and more ambitious goals such as trying to lose weight, or climbing the Matterhorn in Switzerland, or even publishing in Nature. So we're trying to navigate our day-to-day in achieving these goals, and to be able to do that, we need to keep focus on the goal, we need to keep it in mind, and more importantly, we need to try and resist temptation on the way of achieving that goal. And that requires us to inhibit impulses that would stop us from achieving those long-term goals. So cognitive control then, in terms of a more formal definition, supports flexible and adaptive responses to environmental changes in the pursuit of goals that we have in mind. And it's been shown to be incredibly important for a range of other domains and real life outcomes. So it supports quality of social relationships. It is very predictive of academic attainment. It's strongly related to well-being as well as mental and physical health. And even more importantly, the extent or abilities of cognitive control during childhood are highly, highly predictive of cognitive control later life and all those other outcomes and aspects related to cognitive control later in life. So as such, it's a really foundational cognitive skill that's important for a range of domains which are really important for later life success and well-being. Now, given that cognitive control plays such a core role in our everyday lives, there's been a lot of discussion and attempts to try and support cognitive control and improve it through dedicated trainings. So I'll talk a little bit about plasticity and the literature so far on plasticity of cognitive control. So it's a really, really important question, given how important the executive functions and cognitive control are for later life well-being. Now, so far to date, most of the work and attempts to try and improve cognitive control have focused on working memory. So that's the ability to keep information in mind. So, and if we relate this to keeping goals in mind, working memory is very, very important. If we keep forgetting what it is that we wanted to do, then we wouldn't be able to achieve it in the first place. So working memory plays a really important role in all of this. But the evidence has been quite limited in terms of studies on training cognitive control. So it's been primarily focused on working memory. And the basic logic behind trying to improve cognitive control or working memory in this particular case is this, that, we see a very strong relationship in children, for instance, between individual differences or abilities in working memory, so the extent to which we can keep information in mind, and academic achievements such as maths or reading or IQ. So there's a very well-established relationship between the two. And the idea is then that if we try and improve or train working memory, we also ought to see associated improvement in these related domains, such as academic achievement and IQ, but we don't actually see that. So by now, there's a lot of evidence that these so-called file transfer effects are extremely elusive and very, very difficult to get. And this is baffling for a range of different reasons, because we know that experiences generalize in long-lasting ways in natural learning contexts, so just taking education, for instance. And we also know that executive functions or cognitive control, it can be persistently affected by negative events. So, stress, for instance, that can really impact cognitive control in long-lasting ways. So why is it so hard to really improve and train cognitive control in long-lasting ways? So the main question that we've pursued in our lab is whether improving cognitive control transfers to other domains, and if it does, whether it's also durable. So I'll talk a little bit about the training and go into the actual approach that we use to do this, which is where Cauldron came in and has been incredibly creative and supportive, trying to get this off the ground. So the basic idea is that sort of at the very core of all of this is a very simple cognitive control task. This is called a stop signal reaction time task, where participants are asked to respond to the presentation of a visual stimulus on a screen. Each time they see a circle, for instance, they're meant to press a button. And on some trials, 25% of the trials, they hear an auditory stimulus. And when they hear the auditory stimulus, which is played with a very, very short delay after the visual stimulus, they have to inhibit. And what's interesting is that the delay between the go signal and the stop signal waxes and wanes with individual performance. And the shorter the delay is, the easier it is to inhibit, and the longer the delay is, the harder it is to inhibit. So this is a very simple test which allows us to look at individual differences in cognitive control abilities, but also the fact that there is such a thing as a stop signal delay, which is what this is called. It allows us to use this to actually train inhibition in a really nice and well-controlled and adaptive fashion. So that's exactly what we did. We leveraged this particular very, very simple cognitive task to train inhibition. So we had two groups that trained. One was the cognitive control training, or what we call the experimental group. They were asked to respond to the go signal and to inhibit to the stop signal. That was the experimental group. And then we had a control group, which just trained response speed. So every time they saw the visual stimulus, they pressed a button as fast as they could. And what was really important is that the task got easier and harder depending on how good individual participants were over these over individual trainings. Now, one of the core challenges in all of this is that we need lots and lots of training to see durable effects. So what we went for, we designed a training that lasted 8 weeks in total, and where our participants were asked to train 4 times a week. And to make sure that they actually do this training as well, we had to implement a couple of features. And again, that's where the creativity of Cauldron came in. So first off, we opted to making this gamified. If we present participants with this task, they would get bored very, very quickly. And in our particular case, we were looking at children to sort of increase the impact of all of this. And if we didn't make this in a gamified fashion, interesting fashion, then they get very, very bored and drop out very quickly. So the gamification was absolutely key, and I'll give you a couple of examples how we did this. We tried to make it very variable throughout. We made it adaptive. So as I said, the training got easier and harder depending on how good our participants were. We made it complex and diverse. So I'll show you exactly how we did that. So we presented children with an overarching narrative by telling them that they had crashed a plane. They were a pilot and they'd crashed a plane in the desert. And to fix their plane, they needed to find the sage. And the sage was able to give them spare parts. And to get the spare parts from the sage, they needed to collect treasure along the way. And to get the treasure, they navigated these different worlds. And in these worlds, they were presented with tasks that gave them treasure, but also these tasks were used to train cognitive control. So I'll just give a short video here. So this is just a visual presentation here. This is where our participants were at any given point in the worlds which they navigated. So here they are just about to enter a world, and we gave them a couple of choices in terms of the kind of world that they're about to enter. Before each game, they were given instructions, and here is one of the sets of instructions. So here they were meant to press a button each time they see a rock, but sometimes there would be a gem displayed on the rock, and when that happens, there you go, they were meant to press the button. So that's exactly an indication of a go trial and a stop trial. So we had 8 different games designed like this, and we changed the setting, we changed the context in ways to try and make this interesting and engaging. So what I'm going to present to you now, isn't it fun? I love these games. So what I'm going to present to you now is a little bit more of the methods and then some of the data in terms of how children actually engage with these games. So we use this training to address what the effect of cognitive control training is on various outcome measures and whether these effects hold up after a 1-year follow-up. We looked at this in 209 children from the Greater London area. The mean age was around 9 years. And here's the basic design. We had pre-training of a particular set of transfer domains or training domains. We looked at executive functions. decision-making, task, mental health, and academic achievement, as well as brain structure and brain function. Then children engaged in 8 weeks of the training, and we looked at whether there was any change as a function of the training immediately afterwards, and then 1 year afterwards. Now, we all know what happened a year and a half ago, a little less than a year and a half ago. COVID struck, so we were a little bit flummoxed by this, but again, because all of this was done online, we could navigate this really, really beautifully, and that was a huge plus of having designed all of this in the way that we had with Cauldron. So I'm not going to present you any of the transfer. What I'll show you now is just how exactly children engage with the training, because this is so incredibly exciting and encouraging for a range of different reasons. So first, I'm going to look at the actual amount of training that total. There were 32 sessions that children could have done over their 8 weeks. And what we see here, here's the experimental group, here's the control group. We see really nice normal distribution. And we see that overall children participated in around 18 training sessions. Each training session lasted around 15 minutes. And some even made it right through up until the 32. So that was really, really nice. What's particularly nice is that children in both groups trained approximately equally. So there are no differences between the groups, and that makes it really nice because we can then genuinely compare any effects pre-post due to the nature of the training as opposed to the amount of training that children had engaged in. Another feature that we implemented just to sort of gauge motivation is we had a couple of bonus games. So after each training session, children did training. So what we have here is the percent of children, percent of bonus games that children engaged in, and what we see around 30% of the bonus games were actually taken up on, which is again quite a nice feature that children were really motivated to do more of the training than we had actually asked them to. And again, this is comparable between the two groups. Now it gets better. So we also asked children, so each week we did the training at school, and at school we gave them a little questionnaire to ask them how much they enjoyed the training, how much they liked it, whether they felt they'd gotten better at whatever it is that they were training. So what we see here, the top score is 40. So we summed these over 7 questions. The top score is 40, and here we've got the means. The means are sort of reasonable. I think children were pretty engaged throughout, and it was similar for both groups. And now what's really, really striking is here we see the motivation change over the weeks of training that happened. What we actually see is that both groups seem to increase in terms of their motivation. So even though the training itself was sort of a significant portion of time that they did each week, but children actually became more motivated doing the training. And that was absolutely incredible and really, really surprising, because usually what you'd see, the more you do something, unless it's actually incredibly enjoyable, you'll see a drop in motivation, but we don't see that here. We actually see an increase in motivation, and that's really, really lovely. So again, wonderful, and it's comparable across the two groups. And now what I'm going to show you is just the extent to which the children improved on the tasks that they actually trained during the training. So here we have the inhibition measure, and this is the group of children that did the inhibition. And here we see the ability to inhibit across the different sessions. And what's absolutely amazing is that virtually all children improve on the core task that we wanted to train with inhibition. And we saw exactly the same for our control group. So children, the children that trained inhibition improved on inhibition, the children that trained on response speed improved on response speed. So with these data, we really are in the best possible position to actually look at our effects and our transfer effects as genuine. It doesn't really matter almost at this point whether we see anything or not. The training itself has worked extremely well in terms of engagement, in terms of motivation, and in terms of improving.
Sorry about that. We don't know what happened. For some reason, the session just ended. You had got to your slide where you were showing us the impact of the training scores on the SSRT and in your control condition. Can you go back to that slide?
Yeah,
and in fact, there's a question from one of the participants, is what did the control participants improve on the SSRT?
No, the control condition, their aim was to just get faster, basically, at responding. So the improvement for the SSRT was only seen for the group that trained SSRT, and the control participants only improved on reaction time. So they got faster.
Brilliant. Now, why don't you continue from where you left off?
Sure. I mean, it's pretty much done, actually. I'm so sorry. So just want to conclude, the training uptake was really excellent. Participants were very motivated, which even increased over time. Key cognitive functions that were meant to be trained improved. So we're really in an absolute ideal position from which to examine near and far transfer effects. So to reference, the SAGE games are pretty close to perfect to do cognitive training studies with children, which is absolutely wonderful. So yeah, just thanking the lab, the funders, you for your attention, and obviously Cauldron for the wonderful, wonderful, extremely accommodating and patient collaboration. It was yeah, really terrific. And I think these results absolutely speak for themselves.
Yeah, well, you're more than welcome, Nico. The work you and your team do is really extraordinary. Now, I was saying this before you joined in. So many researchers have been trying to measure transfer effects in the lab and have failed to do so for years and years and years. And you have succeeded, or at least we've got the beginnings of a glimpse that you are succeeding. What impact do you think that's going to have on your area of research and related areas of research? What does this open up as for possibilities?
I think so. I mean, I guess the jury's potentially still a little bit out on whether we actually have transfer effects. So I think we're in the best possible position to really examine whether we do. And I think the amount of data that we have collected gives us a huge amount of leverage in terms of being able to understand why the training would be effective, because, you know, we've recorded every single session of a participant. We can look at the waxing and waning across sessions. We can look at the fluctuations, and that gives an enormous scope to really explore what it is that potentially leads to and explain transfer effects. So, I mean, I think if we do end up demonstrating that this is possible, I think that'd be just hugely exciting, because sort of on the one hand, showing that children are very motivated to do this. I think there would be a lot of scope to try and collaborate with schools, and in terms of implementing this more in the curriculum, both on the one hand looking at positive effects on mental health, but also looking at attainment, but also looking at social abilities and quality of social relationships. I think these are aspects that matter massively to child development. And I think if we do really genuinely show some transfer effects, then the potential for application is absolutely enormous, Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Nico. We're going to stick around because we're going to have a panel discussion between the three games experts at the end of this session. But for now, Dan, do you want to come turn your slides on, join me, and we're going to talk about multiplayer games, I believe. So Dan was, in fact, one of my lecturers at UCL when I studied psychology. He's absolutely tremendous, one of the best lecturers in the world. And he's going to share with you today all the amazing stuff that he's been doing. Dan, over to you.
All right, hello. I'm going to assume that's all working and you haven't all disappeared into the ether. So thanks very much for your patience and sticking with these very intense sessions. So yeah, today I'm talking about pirates, pub quizzes, and park life. And Joe asked me to talk about how to study group processes with games. And when she first asked me, I really didn't understand what she was talking about, and then I realized, looking at these other talks, that like several of these speakers, I began as a developmental psychologist. And if you do that, you know that you have to make an experiment that's fun and engaging, or your participant bursts into tears and screams at you. So I've always had that mindset that an experiment is something that has to engage the person doing it. And I think often what we do with experiments is we think of them as a task given to an employee, and it's their job just to go through it. But from the participant's perspective, it's always something like a game. They want to win. They are worried about whether or not they seem good. They want to strategize. So I think always thinking about every experiment as a type of game is a much more useful and valid way to approach it. But I might return to some people who disagree with that perspective right at the end. Let me tell you about what we've been doing using games for group processes. So what I look at in my lab very broadly is collective experience or social context. So what is the value of being around other people in the way that we haven't for a long, long year? What does that do to us emotionally? How do we coordinate our behavior? How do we coordinate our physiology? We look at heartbeats with people watching musicals. And how does it change our social affiliation? How are we connected to these other people? And how might that change our decision making? Most decisions that we make when we use our language or decision-making processes, it's with other people. Yet mostly when we study them, it's in a tiny laboratory cubicle that excludes other people. So I got interested in these sort of effects of social context and ways that we could study them. And with my graduate student at the time, Una von Zimmerman, the Wellcome Trust helped us develop this tool, which actually Cauldron developed. I think they did this before they did Gorilla. It's a system we called the Hive, where you have your little device in front of you and you sign in. And then you get a dot on your device and you move that dot. And at the front of the room, there's a big screen with your dot on it. And if you do this in an auditorium, there's your dot and there's a dot of 50 other people. And this means we can ask people questions and they can respond as individuals, and they can look up and see what the group is doing. And we can look at that group dynamic, at that interplay between what I think and what I think in front of other people and how I coordinate with them. So we've used it in various different ways. This is just a little experiment looking at the wisdom of the crowds, where we get people to say, how much does this creature weigh? That's a liger. And they drag their little dots to give their answer. The star there is the average answer. Right now, they can't see each other's responses. I've drawn them back in. And what you find, just as Galton observed a long time ago, is you get a distribution of answers, but the average of those answers is really hauntingly correct. He called it the wisdom of the crowds. And we showed that if people can see each other's dots, if you turn those on so they give their responses knowing what other people think, what happens is that wisdom of the crowd filters away. People can see what other people think, and they move to be close together, and gradually they drag themselves farther and farther away from the true answer. So we can give people these little sort of quizzes, and we can look at that group dynamic of how people change their response, seeing what other people believe. And what we are particularly interested in my lab is not just how are we affected by other people, but how am I affected by my people? And of course, we know from social psychology, there are multiple layers of these social identities that we connect to other people like the same music or fashion or support the same football club. And we're all, as individuals, a mixture of all these social identities. And we've been using these games to try and pick these things apart. And together with my colleagues, this is their work actually, they found that many of the behaviors that we think of as purely automatic are actually structured by social identities. So, you know, the textbook thing is that yawning is a contagious automatic thing. But they showed if they showed their students these pictures, but said these are also students from the University of St. Andrews, or these are students from the University of Glasgow up the road. If they're my people, I'm more likely to have that yawn be contagious. I'm more likely to start yawning if those are my people. So we've been trying to pick this apart and quantify it. And again, we give these people these little choices where they drag the dot to one of these paintings here, and we tell them that you're either red or that you're blue. So it's a minimal group paradigm to put people in a group with other people who have the same artistic preferences as themselves. And then they drag their dots around. We say, just move to a green blob. We give them these arbitrary decisions. And of course, they start copying each other. They move as a red team or they move as a blue team. Even though that's a free choice, they tend to be nudged and to cluster along with people in their social group. And so what I've just shown you, that's a real experiment done at the Science Museum. We spent the past 6 months putting all that infrastructure of the Hive, which was designed for a room with a large screen, putting that online. So now people can play the same sort of games, but virtually online. We can use them for real group interactions, and I'll show you some in a minute, or we can sort of cheat a little bit and make people think they're having a real group interaction, but in fact, they're watching pre-recorded slides. So what I'm about to show you is all done with video. And this is a video of me. That's me on the right. That's also me there. You can see 3 Daniels. That's too many Daniels. But I'm imagining being a participant in this study where we trick people into thinking they're engaged in a video interaction. So it sort of looks like this. So we have deliberately made the videos a bit glitchy because, as we've seen, Zoom is always glitchy.
12. Okay, great. We're all here. Okay.
So this is all pre-recorded. So these are all pre-recorded videos of me, but I'm being the experimenter talking to them, and they think they're one person surrounded by other people. So all those people are pre-recorded videos, apart from that little thumbnail of me that's a live view of me watching it, listening to me, the experimenter. This is more confusing than I had in mind. But you do little bits of interaction to trick people like this.
Okay, so let me just check everything is working. If you can see and hear me, could you give me a wave or a thumbs up? Okay, great. If you can see yourself and you can see everyone else, can you give me a wave and a thumbs up? Perfect. All right, it's working.
So you just have a little bit of contingency built in. You set the expectation, say, I'm turning off your microphone so it's not weird that no one's talking. And you can pretty much convince people, about 70% of people thought, yeah, this is some sort of weird Zoom hybrid game I'm playing with other people. And then you can look at the social effects of who are those people. So here we just put them in red or blue teams, and then they had a pub quiz together. So we asked them questions like this, and you can play along.
Now return to the hive again, get into the middle. What is the population of chickens in the world? How many chickens are there? The correct answer, surprisingly, is almost 24 billion.
So there you go. And of course, we can just quantify the degree to which people gave their answer going along with their people. And we introduced little things like that buffering screen when we weren't really buffering, but every video thing does buffer. So we put in some sort of fake tech failures to make it more plausible. So as I say, that was a pre-recorded video, but you can also have real interactions between people because we've taken all of that Hive infrastructure and put it into Gorilla. So people can join from Prolific and they just get thrown in a room with 6 other people also from the Prolific pool. And we were engaged in an experiment with the Science Gallery Bengaluru, having a exhibit about the history and art, lots of things around the idea of contagion. So they came to talk to us and we did the contagion of behavior and how it spreads. And we ran over 300 people from India and across the world. Engaged in this particular thing. It was very difficult because, of course, the pandemic hit India even farther. Then cyclones hit India. It was a very challenging thing. But we got an enormous number of data, which was a lot of fun to collect. And we set this up. And our question here was, OK, we know there's an effect of being on the red or the blue team, but is that a gradual dial? Is there a gradual effect of being more or less close to these people? So we varied levels of social identity. I'll tell you how in a second. And then we asked them to make various decisions, and they played various games like this Park Life game, which I'll end on telling you in about 5 minutes. So how do we turn the dial on this level of perceptual identity? Well, they're playing this game of pirates. We had a whole narrative of me doing a pirate voice, which I'm not doing for you right now. And we asked them things like, OK, here's the ballerina who washed ashore, and what direction is she rotating with? And we suggested that the rotation you see tells us something about your personality. We said some people think this. Actually, it doesn't at all in terms of the science of it, but we suggested that maybe this gives us an indication into your personality. And people gave their responses. I see that rotation or that rotation. And then we told them what the other people playing thought. But this was faked information. This was fake feedback. And of course, we debriefed all of this afterwards. So in one case, we said, OK, you saw anti-clockwise rotation, and all the other people who saw that, they're all blue. Or on the other hand, we said, well, all but one were blue, and then there's one red. And we could gradually turn the dial down on how many people on your team saw the same rotations you, therefore are like you. So we varied this level of group cohesion. And then we played various games. We looked at how that social influence spread. So in one case, we said, oh, your ship is sinking. Do you want to stay on the ship and risk it, or do you want to flee to an island? And we had dots moving in particular ways, seeing if people followed their team, and if that depended on who they thought was in that team. And what we found, this is brand new data, that as we gradually increase that group level, we increase the probability that people followed their teammates. There was a more or less linear increase as I felt more and more of these other blue dots. Yeah, they're like me. They see the same rotation. So we had it on a series of decision-making tasks. And we also got them to play this game, Park Life. So what is Park Life? This is a whole project, and I'm just showing you the last window of it. On Park Life, it's like one of these sort of farm simulators, these little games where you tap a button, you grow resources, and then you sort of grow something. And in this game, what you grow is a park. It used to be a park in London, but we changed it so that it's a park on a desert island in this case. And the idea is that you tap, 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 and every time you tap as a team, it grows a park feature. What we did in this game, though, was introduce an inequality. So the red team have to tap more than the blue team because they found less treasure in some previous game. So the two teams are playing these games, but the red team are disadvantaged. And what we're interested in is whether that unfairness, that disadvantage, that resentment they might feel would translate into antisocial behavior. So you could tap, tap, tap to grow your park, or you could flick a switch and tap, and then you start to vandalize the other side's park. And that's what we're interested in, how that level of inequality translates into antisocial behavior. There's a whole background from the London riots that inform this. So there they are tapping away. And indeed, we found that as your degree of connection with the people around you increased, then the degree to which you took that inequality as a negative and turned that into antisocial action increased. So people are very sensitive, not just to this is my team, but these are people who I'm connected with, and that changed their response to social inequality. It changed the way that they approach the whole game. So there's many other things about that project, but I just want to end so we don't overrun a little early. And I just want to end just with a few comments, because I think many of us might agree with the overall idea, since you're here on a session about gamifying research, but you will run into resistance. And I'm in the middle of a huge argument with a viewer at the moment who basically saw these park life games and said, well, that's just a game. Right, we're interested in riots and antisocial behavior. But he said, well, your little game, that's nothing like a real riot where people could be imprisoned, or they could be physically damaged. They might go to prison. There's nothing like a real riot. And we've involved this big argument, which I think you will find if ever you do gamified research, we say, well, it's not supposed to be a simulation of a riot. That's not what a game is. We're not trying to get every single aspect of this phenomena and replicate it like it's in virtual reality in a lab. A game is just some elements of that psychological mechanism, that connection between frustration and antisocial behavior. We're just trying to capture that in a small game. So you shouldn't hold us to the criteria of being an unrealistic simulation. That's misunderstanding what a game is. And it's misunderstanding what an experiment is, really. I mean, we've learned enormous amounts from the prisoner dilemma experiments, but no one's actually gone to jail after a prisoner's dilemma, right? It's all a hypothetical little interaction. So games are not simulations, and that's a really important point that if you ever do this research, one reviewer will throw back at you. And in the other degree, as I was saying at the start, well, all experiments are a form of play and a form of interaction. So I don't think there's anything unusual about gamified research and non-gamified research. It's all games that people will engage with. And thirdly, this literally just occurred to me this morning is, well, games are important. Why? Because that's how we learn, right? I mean, that's how kids learn. They play fight, they play house, they pretend things. That's how a team will change. They will play and they will do drills. And this whole idea of a simulation of a real phenomena as being a way to learn about it, that's a human characteristic, might be a mammalian characteristic. I don't know enough about it, but it certainly isn't a natural thing. All the time, play is how we learn and how we develop. So rather than being an unusual thing, an experiment that's like a game is getting right at the heart of how we adapt and how we change our behavior. Anyway, I'm going to end there just so we have time for a discussion. Thank you very much for your patience and your time. I have too many collaborators to thank, but there they are.
Dan, that was incredible. I'm trying to, yeah, that was absolutely extraordinary. Thank you. Gosh, I think really the bit that's sitting with me there at the end the most is this notion that experiments are just play, education is just play. Actually, quite a lot of life is just play. We're sort of playing a lot of the time until we actually need the skill. That's how we hone our skills for that time when we need it. So maybe more of life is in fact play and practice, and only a very small amount of it is actually having to do it. Like I practice my piano for far more than I ever perform the piano, and that practicing is the play. So everybody who's here in the room, can you put in the chat what you took away from that session with Dan? Because I thought that was extraordinary, this new way of looking at social processes of people interacting together in real time. That was amazing. Now, Dan, Nico, Diana, can you all put your cameras on so that we can all be on screen together? I think things might just be more interesting if you talk to each other, because you're all using games in such interesting and different ways. You might have great questions for each other. So Diana, why don't you go first?
Yes, I'm still trying to process it all, actually, because those were two such rich talks. You know, I've got a kind of kludge in my head of the two of them.
How about you?
Yeah.
I mean, just go first, or do you want to jump in?
No. Do see if the others want to go first, because as I said, I really am still processing.
I think I'm feeling much the same, actually. I mean, it's just, I think, probably to sort of confirm maybe what the point of the session was, I'm just so very, very struck by the versatility of how these games can be used to study such a huge range of different phenomena and processes and questions. Really, absolutely astonishing. Yeah, I suppose, I mean, Dan, you present such a sort of nice and coherent program of studies there. How did you find it easy to implement that, I suppose? I just find there's so much trial and error, especially teasing out some of these, more fine-grained social phenomena. How easy did you find it to use those interfaces? And
yeah, I mean, there's two separate bits, right? There's the technical stuff, i.e. Joe and Nick's problem, and then there's sort of the design question of how you engage people. And it was hugely technically challenging, particularly the experiments we ran in India. They faced pandemics and cyclones taking out half the Wi-Fi masts in Bangalore. It was just a nightmare. So it's a miracle we got any data at all. And but it's really impressive that the technology is just robust enough to work. So there's a technical side of it that Joe and Nick can tell you more about, because I just throw requests at them and they do it, swearing at me behind their hands, I'm sure. But then there's sort of the element of how do you design those things so people want to do them? Exactly. And there, I think we benefited completely accidentally by how we started doing this, because we got the grant from the Wellcome Trust to develop this technology to be a tool to engage people, to give talks about social science using this tool. And as an afterthought, we also collect data. So we began right from the start thinking we have to, people are going to pay £5 for a ticket. We began thinking we have to be engaging and entertaining, and that's always sort of structured it. And that was accidental, just how we started, but I think it's really helped us in the long run.
And that's actually been a theme all the way through today. And I think it was in both of your sessions, of how what we're trying to do is to engage the people who are participating at quite a deep level. And we're trying to be as inventive as we can to try and do that. It's such an important part of it. And as you say, games can be used in so many different ways, but what is it that's common to all of them? What is it, that essence of engagement that we're all striving for? How do you characterize that? Have you conceptualized it? I mean, I tried to with, saying, it's about challenge and response and immediate feedback and that kind of thing. But I mean, you may have different ways of characterizing it.
I don't personally, and I remember trying and failing to write an essay, and Wittgenstein wrote half a book on what a game is. I tried to write an essay on it when I was a philosophy undergraduate, but I left that way behind. So no, I think that's a real difficult challenge to try and put your finger on the exact cluster of features.
So I guess a couple of things that we try to really leverage is, there's some interesting literature on engagement generally, and agency has been sort of highlighted as one really core facet in all of this. And I think this is something that we really try to just to make children feel as agentic as they possibly can in terms of how they engage with what they're doing. So, I think the bonus games was one just giving them the illusion of control. I mean, of course, we still try to do this in a very, very controlled way, but along the way, they had a couple of meaningless choices that they could make. But I think that was still very, very important in terms of, having that compliance and that enthusiasm as high as one can get it.
Yes, I agree. And in the context of a game for learning, it's so unusual for students to have agency in the context of education. It's all sort of done to them to a certain degree. And what I found so powerful about the idea of constructionism was that Pappert's point was it was all about making things yourself, not having to have somebody there tell you what to do or tell you whether you've done it well or appropriately or not, but to be your own agent of evaluation as well as ideas about what to do next and so on.
That was very eloquently put. To put it less eloquently, if you go to a science museum, right, what do you see is these kids, the first thing you do is bash that button to make something happen in the exhibit. And once they made something happen, then they try and figure out, oh, what is this all about? But what they really want to do is to make things happen.
Have we got time for one other point, Joe?
Yes, I think we've got time for one more point, and then we're going
Because there was one thing that you said almost in passing, Dan, was that you always get this sort of thing from reviewers complaining about this is just a game, you know. And I mean, that's certainly a problem that we have in the context of something like maths education, is that maths education people say, oh, no, it's digital, and oh, no, this is not really maths, and things like that. So it can be very hard to get this stuff past reviewers sometimes. I don't know if you've both experienced that kind of issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly if it's a sort of a cross-discipline journal as well.
Exactly.
That's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to be so rude as to complain about reviews in public, but at the moment I'm at the stage of, well, I guess they just don't believe experiments work. And so I'm just asking the editor to make a call about whether they think the research, because I'm never going to convince this person that I'm not trying to do a simulation. It's never going to happen. So
I agree.
I've sort of given up on that particular argument.
It's a bizarre problem with working in a multidisciplinary context, is that reviewers tend to be somewhat monodisciplinary, and you can sometimes pull the wool over their eyes amazingly, and they think, oh, this is wonderful, when actually it's not wonderful. It's a bit experimental, to be honest. And then at the same time, you'll get the exact opposite as well. So
absolutely. And I was quite it was really disappointing, because this reviewer said, this game of a riot, it is ridiculing the work of serious researchers.
That doesn't help.
Obviously, that was the last thing we're trying to do. But then, you know, just to make a mere game of an important phenomena to them was insulting.
I do see that.
Okay, brilliant. This has been absolutely fascinating. There are lots of questions in the Q&A, and I know you know how to pull those up, and you can have a go at answering them after this. I found the discussion between the three of you fascinating, so I wanted to let it run. One of the things I took away from this session was that when we're watching the buffet of research talks, people were worried about, well, maybe paying participants will change their behavior and make it not a real measure of how people behave in real life. And now we've gamified it so people are engaged and attentive, and they're doing it of their own volition. But maybe this is not representative of how people behave in their own life. And I think that's the theme coming out here. Whenever we're putting something in front of somebody and asking them to do it for science, it's not going to be representative of their real life, but it's by triangulating these different techniques, doing stuff in the lab, doing stuff online with paid participants, doing stuff with games. It's if all three of those show the same results, then you can start thinking about running field experiments and rolling them out into the real world. But we have to go on this journey of first having the idea and then testing it. We can't jump straight to the destination until we have an idea about what works. So to the three of you, Dan, Nico, Diana, you've been absolutely brilliant. Thank you. If you've enjoyed that session, can you please say in the chat something like games or like wow, just so that our three speakers today know that they've done an excellent job today. Now, what I'm going to do now is bring Nick Hodges from Gorilla on to show you the new tools that's available inside Gorilla, so that you guys can build games yourself as easily as you can build online tasks.